Okay, so now we can look at the static model and see how fiscal policy would look. And if you've worked with the monetary policy in the static model, this will look very much the same. So the mechanics of how this happens is different. With monetary policy, it's through the Federal Reserve and its actions on the interest rates. On fiscal policy, it's the actions of the President and the Congress, and what they do is government spending and taxes. But those are the details. Just looking at the static model, we have two scenarios written here. On the left-hand side is a recession picture, and on the right-hand side is a boom picture. So looking at the recession, what we can see is we are currently below our full potential. We want to figure out a way to nudge aggregate demand to the right. And so all we really need to do is come up with expansionary fiscal policy. So this will be the expansionary policy, right? And what are ways that we can cause aggregate demand to grow? When we think about the components of aggregate demand, consumption, investment, government spending, net exports. When we looked at monetary policy, it was about changing interest rates to impact consumption, investment, and net exports, but we didn't have an impact on government spending. When we look at fiscal policy, that is specifically what we can do. By increasing G, right, you are going to increase aggregate demand. It is a part of the aggregate demand component. Now, taxes is a little more subtle. It's not part directly of aggregate demand, right? It's not consumption, investment, government spending, or net exports. But if you pay taxes, I think you can imagine how it affects your consumption. So when taxes increase, the way we talk about how households do their decisions is they make their income, they pay their taxes, and with what's left over, they consume and they save. So if you increase taxes, the what's left over is a lot less. So there is less to consume and there is less for savings. So higher taxes would reduce aggregate demand. So the picture we drew here would be a decrease in taxes, all right? So basically, expansionary fiscal policy is either increasing government spending, cutting taxes, or a combination of both. And that's how we can get this picture here of the expansionary policy. So you can probably guess what contractionary will look like. It'll be our diagram here on the right-hand side, where we have aggregate demand beyond our potential, and we want to nudge it back. So to nudge it back, pretty much hit it there, we need to send it to the left. We want to reduce aggregate demand. We're trying to contract the economy, not so much because we want to reduce GDP. Yes, we're going to reduce GDP, as you can see, but specifically usually because we're trying to reduce inflation. So things are getting a little out of hand out here. All right, so you can probably guess where we're going with this as far as how to actually cause this picture to happen. It's going to be the opposite of expansionary policy. But again, if I'm trying to reduce aggregate demand through changes in government spending, I want to reduce G. And as I was discussing in the tax scenario, if you increase taxes, then there's less left over for consumers to have. So consumptions will go down, and that would also do this picture here. Now we can look at fiscal policy and the dynamic model. We'll again start with the assumption that we are coming from a long-run equilibrium, and as we have growth, because the dynamic model allows everything to grow, we see that aggregate demand does not quite keep up with the growth in our productive ability, and so we end up in a recessionary looking environment there. So this is going to be what's going to happen if there's no policy, all right, no policy. So what we want to say is, hey, what can we do about fiscal policy if we're able to see this coming? And so since we're in a recessionary environment, we're looking at increasing government spending to kind of stimulate the economy and nudge aggregate demand to the right, and or cutting taxes. And so we just need to come up with a little bit of a nudge here as I've drawn it to actually end up here, right at the long-run equilibrium. So aggregate demand with policy. And that would be an example of expansionary fiscal policy with the dynamic model. And so you can also imagine a scenario where my yellow no policy curve actually went beyond And so as we have the growth and we see the economy's going too fast, we can raise taxes or cut spending and cause it to come back here. Now, of course, it's not quite as simple as this, but this is the idea. This is like the goal you would have in mind when trying to do fiscal policy. Fiscal policy has a lot of other issues we want to mention pretty quickly here. One is the timing of fiscal policy is very difficult. If you've ever watched that Schoolhouse Rock, I'm just a bill on Capitol Hill, and it's telling you about how the bills are supposed to be written and passed, it's a very long, slow, drawn out process. And if you watch politics at all, you know it doesn't work very often in recent years. And that is, of course, by design, because they didn't want a very busy government writing a lot of laws. But when we're dealing with an economic situation like this, you might need quick action. And so in general, fiscal policy doesn't work that well because of the timing. You do see exceptions. In 2009 financial crisis, you saw a very quick reaction. Whether it was good or not is another question, but you did see a very quick reaction as Congress came together and wrote TARP and did something. So it does happen. Another problem with fiscal policy, though, is even with it taking a while to pass and get through, and even though they can occasionally come together and do it quickly, just having it passed doesn't mean it instantly happens. Now you have to get it implemented, and that often takes up to a year. So if you think about what we were saying here, that we could foresee that in this case we're going to have a recession, as I drew it here, and we want to help nudge the economy. If it takes too long to do it, the economy might have already worked its way back up here when the spending and tax cut actually hits. So timing can be a real problem. And then there's two more things we want to talk about that are an extra layer of complexity for fiscal policy, the multiplier effect and crowding out. All right, so here we'll just go back to the static model to keep things simple. But we'll start with the scenario where we have a recession and Congress and President are trying to increase government spending and or cut taxes to fix the scenario. And we can see here that we're starting here and we want to end up here. And we're not going to do any of the calculations that are involved, but you can imagine what we're basically saying is I need to increase GDP by this amount, so I must need to increase G by that amount, right? That'd be nice and simple. But the truth is, no, it's not necessary to increase government spending by the total amount of increase you need to nudge the line across. And it has to do with the multiplier effect. All right, so that's the first thing we want to talk about is the multiplier effect. So the idea here is that when the government does, let's just do spending. This also applies to taxes, but we'll just do a spending as an example. If the government increases spending by $100 billion, that was $100 billion that wasn't going to be spent, and that spending becomes somebody's income. The contractors they hire, the equipment they buy, and the materials they buy, all of that is somebody's income. So that $100 billion is an extra $100 billion in income by some of the people out in the country. So when an extra $100 billion of income shows up, people pay taxes, of course, but then they consume some and they save some. All right, well, it's that consume some which is the multiplier effect. There is a round of consumption that is happening that would never have happened if you hadn't had the government spending. So essentially, you have the first hit to aggregate demand from the government spending, and then you would have, well, okay, maybe let me squeeze another line in there. First, you have this nudge from the government spending, and then you have a second nudge from the multiplier effect, and that nudge keeps working and working and working until the multiplier effect has worked out completely. So it's subsequent rounds of it. Each round is slightly smaller because every time it's somebody's new income, I'll go back to the example I was using. So there's an extra $100 billion of spending. So let's say that of that $100 billion of income, that leads to an extra $60 billion in in consumption. Now that $60 billion of extra consumption is $60 billion of income to somebody. So they'll save some and consume some, and so now there's maybe another $36 billion. And as we go through these rounds of additional income leading to additional consumption, that is what we call the multiplier effect, and that could be drawn this way, where you get these little nudges. So again, there is a calculation you can do here, but the idea is you figure out how much G needs to increase to allow the multiplier effect to take hold and nudge us here. So in some ways, it's like we found the money tree, right? You want a $10 billion impact on GDP, and all you have to do is increase spending by $1 billion. Wow, that's awesome. The truth is, there's, of course, disagreement on how big the multiplier effect is. There's various studies that seem to show it ranges somewhere between 1 and 2 And a multiplier effect of 1 is basically no additional impact, and then all the way to 2, that you might get $2 worth of spending for every $1 you do. But that doesn't really matter. Just realize that there is a multiplier effect from government spending, and there is one from taxes as well. There is one other thing, though, that puts a damper on fiscal policy, and that is the thing called crowding out. So crowding out is going to have the opposite effect of the multiplier effect. It's going to push us back this way. And crowding out has an impact that's a little different in the short run than in the long run. So basically, in the short run, what's going on is, where did the money come from that the government is spending? Right? They did an extra $100 billion of spending. Where did that come from? Well, they had to come from the market in some way. They either had to raise taxes, they had to go out and borrow the money. So there's a market called loanable funds with the demand for funds and the supply of funds. Basically, the government is going out there and competing with firms for the funds that are available. So if the government issues new government bonds, you as an investor, a true investor, not investment spending, econ speak, but finance speak, you as an investor buying a bond have now bought a government bond, which means you're not making that money available elsewhere. So basically what happens with crowding out is interest rates will go up because of this unintended competition for funds. So this is where you can get a little bit confused. Just remember that monetary policy is interest rates, right? Not fiscal policy. This is not an intended effect. Monetary policy is about setting the interest rate. What we're saying with fiscal policy is it has this sort of accidental impact on interest rates from crowding out. So once you accept that, you can realize that if interest rates are going up as a result of the government spending, increased interest rates means a decrease in aggregate demand. It's going to have this shift to the left here. So to sum up, you have expansionary fiscal policy in this scenario that we're drawing here, which leads to increased aggregate demand because of multiplier effect, but then it kind of pushes back because of crowding out, because of the raised interest rates. And so that obviously makes calculating the impact of fiscal policy a little more complicated. The last thing to say about crowding out is, in the short run, it's generally assumed to be partial. So if we started on this white aggregate demand line, we do not think in the short run that you would completely crowd out. In the long run, though, we do tend to assume, not everybody agrees, but we do tend to say that crowding out is 100% in the long run, that the government increase in spending cannot have a long run impact on aggregate demand. And the easiest way to see that is if you just say that, okay, out of all the expenditures that are happening in the economy, C plus I plus G plus NX. Let's just say government is 30% of that, all right? Then you increase government spending to 35%. In the long run, that means that everybody else can only be 65%. They used to be 70% of spending, now they've been crowded out to 65%. It's just going to redistribute what's available in the long run. So in that sense, fiscal policy is not considered a good thing for the long run. But then again, monetary policy was not about the long run either. All of this nudging of aggregate demand to the left and the right is intended to be a short run fix for the business cycle. So that wraps up what you need to know about fiscal policy and the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model.